Yeah. Yeah, perfect. That sounds good.
So with that, welcome Tim. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Come on, Tim.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And do I just click the mouse to go next?
I believe so. Rich, the mouse should just work, right? Just click on
Okay.
left click. Good.
All right.
I'll help you if you have to go back.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for having me, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come talk to you guys about bats. My main goal here for this first presentation is just to kind of lay a baseline of bats. Many of you know about bats, know about the issues that are out there with northern long-eared bat and the listing, but I wanted to just kind of lay a baseline of what are bats, what other bat species are there in Minnesota, what's their life cycle during the year, you know, what they do in the fall and the winter, and then just kind of the different survey methods that we do to you know, assess their populations and the risks to them. So with that, I'm going to just press that and show you a really cool picture of a bat that occurs in Minnesota. So this is the eastern red bat, a fairly common species. Bats are mammals. I don't know if you guys all know that. I get that question a lot. Are bats really mammals? They are. That's hair on them. They do give live birth. They do produce milk to feed their young, so they are mammals. They're not birds, and they're not flying mice. They are their own order of animals. They're actually, I call them lions because they're kind of apex predators of their habitat. So they're closer to lions than mice. So why are bats important? You know, not only saving ecosystems and saving species, but they also serve an economic purpose for us. It's estimated that anywhere from $3 billion to upwards to $25 billion are saved in the agriculture community by bats controlling the pests. A single little brown bat, which I'll show you in a little bit, it's about the size of your thumb, body size. They can eat 4 to 8 grams or about a grape or two of insects each night. Now, why we're here and why we're talking about bats is the potential listing of northern long-eared bats. That's because of white nose syndrome, and I'll let the other people later on talk about white nose syndrome, but it has killed millions of bats. If we kind of extrapolate the little browns eating patterns, the loss of 1 million bats in the Northeast where white nose was first detected has probably resulted in between 600 and 1,300 metric tons of insects no longer being eaten by bats. So that's quite a lot. So not only, you know, do they serve keeping the ecosystem healthy, but they also serve an economic purpose. So some of the bats that we have in Minnesota, there's 7 here. There's a lot of different species in North America. You know, in the southeast, there's all types of different myotis bats and just other types of bats. In the extreme southwest, we get some nectar-eating bats and some different variety. But here in Minnesota, we've got kind of some of the common ones that are across North America. The tricolored bat, the big brown, silver-haired, the eastern red, hoary, the northern long-eared bat, which you guys may have heard of, and the little brown bat. You'll notice something very interesting. Us bat biologists make it really easy to identify them. They're all color-based and color-coded for our ease of identification. Here's a tricolored bat. It's one of the smallest bat species in North America. You know, when you hold it up in the wingspan, it's just about like that. Called that way, called the tricolored, because if you kind of peel the fur away from there just a little bit, you can see 3 distinct bands. Something cute about them is when you catch them, they're very feisty, but when they bite, it's kind of cute because it doesn't hurt. And so they think they're attacking you viciously, and you can kind of just laugh at them as they gnaw on your knuckle, and it does nothing to you. Here's a close-up of them. As you can see, they're quite adorable. This is a good example here. So I'll just tell you, I mean, a little bit about the wing. They're a lot different than birds. You know, they don't fly similar to birds. They stretch out their hands, and those are fingers. The fingers right there, those long lines right there, are their individual fingers. Oh, very good, thank you. And so that's their arm here, leading into their fingers, and that's their hand bone right there, pinky, ring finger, middle finger, and index. And on their thumb, they've got their thumb is a little hook, and they use that to kind of maneuver within roosts or to crawl around. But basically what they do is they've got really powerful forearms, stretch out their fingers, and then skin in between here, in between their fingers, and going from their pinky down to their feet and between their ankles. And it's very different from birds, which have the fused bones and have feathers and can glide and are very graceful. Bats are graceful, but they have to continually flap, as you guys have seen bats flying around in your neighborhood or whatever. And so this is really elastic skin. It's paper thin. It's kind of leathery, but it's very, as you can see, it's kind of wrinkled here when they're kind of closed up, and when they're, I don't think I've got you'll see another bat picture of when they're flying, but it's very taut, and they can get damage in there, but it grows back really fast. Another common bat species, and actually one of the most common in North America, is the big brown bat. Now these guys are not cute, and they're not fun to have bite your knuckle. These are big bats, and will draw some blood. They're kind of beetle eaters, and they're pretty ferocious. When you get one of these in your net, you know it right away. They're loud, and they're mad, and they stink. So, but these are the ones that you'll typically find in houses. Historically they roosted in trees and just crevices in trees like that when it was just all forest. But now that we've got these great habitats like barns or attics and stuff, these are the bats that you'll find in those habitats. Silver-haired bat, another great color-coded bat that we have. This is another common one that we have caught frequently in Minnesota. It's a black bat with a little touch of silver on the back, much like a silverback gorilla. They're kind of migratory species, but still roost in trees and stuff, and we'll find these in Minnesota and quite a bit more frequently than in other states. I'm hitting it. There we go. Excuse me. So this is the bat I showed you before in flight. This is a close-up, and as you can see, just a beautiful bat. Really, really bright, vibrant colors on this, the eastern red bat, a very common bat species. This is a more medium-sized bat than in between kind of the big brown and definitely the tricolored bat. Fairly common. They roost kind of out in the open in the leaves, and they'll just sleep by themselves, and so they kind of tuck up their wings and then just hide it within the leaves. So you could be walking underneath one and you wouldn't even know it. And I've actually tracked one to its roost and sat there for over an hour just trying to find it amongst each individual leaf, because when they're tucked up and rolled up, it's really hard to distinguish. This is an eastern red bat in flight. You can see how tight the wings are, how tight that skin is, and just kind of all that it takes for them to fly. Much different than feathers on a bird's wing. Hoary bat, very common relative to the eastern red bat. It's very similar fur type with the fur on the tail like that, but they're much larger. In Minnesota, these will be the largest bats that you have. They're another migratory species and will roost by themselves in trees, in the leaves and stuff. They typically fly a little bit higher than the other bats, and we don't catch them as commonly, but we do catch them when they're passing through, and it's a lot of fun because they're really feisty and they're really big. So you got to sometimes put the thicker glove on to handle these guys. This one, I don't know if we need to cover this one. This is the northern long-eared bat. This is one of my favorite bats. It's so adorable. As you can see by the slightly longer ears and the face, it's just a great bat. This is a really good picture. This is the bat that we're all here to talk about. And I'm not going to talk about the regulatory stuff. We'll save that for a little bit later. But just a little bit about the bat, and the later slides that I get into will kind of focus in on this bat in particular. Something that I do as a bat biologist is I'm permitted to identify certain species, and northern long-eared bats are one of those species. And so what I have to do when I capture one of these is look at all these different characteristics. Look at the color. The color is a great starting place. You know, if it's not red, then it's something else because we've only seen that red bat. But then I start to get into other minute details like the forearm size, which is right here. We take a measurement of that after capturing them, and based on the range of size of their forearm, I can kind of determine what species it's not. And then I start to work down the other characteristics of that bat. For northern long-eared bats, it's the kind of relative length of their ear. If you fold that over their nose and it extends beyond 3 millimeters, then it's probably a northern long-eared bat. Because that's kind of variable, another great characteristic is this little flap of skin right here. It's called the tragus, and it's a real spear-like, slender skin compared to the other species that it's related to, like the little brown bat, or in the southern Midwest, the Indiana bat. When I catch a northern long-eared bat or a little brown, another characteristic that I'll look for is their toe hairs. So I mean, we're looking at really minute details of their morphology and just trying to determine what species it is and what species it isn't. So little brown bats have really shaggy toe hairs. Northern long-eared bats have nice manicured feet. Here's a little brown bat in flight. Another really common species. I don't have a great picture of their toe hairs. I'm sorry, I know you guys wanted to see that. But just another really common bat. We caught these, you know, almost the same amount of numbers as we caught the northern long-eared bat this summer. And you know, I'll let the others talk about those survey results later, but another really common forest bat. So let's jump into the life cycle of a bat, and I'm going to kind of focus in on kind of the Myotis species because those are the ones that we're concerned about, in particular northern long-eared bat. Just real quick, when you see NLEB, that's northern long-eared bat, so you know when that comes up a little bit later. So since we're in fall and it's November in a couple days, I thought let's start there. So at this point, after August 15th, a date given to us by the Fish and Wildlife, bats are considered in their fall season. And what they're doing is they're kind of starting to move towards their hibernaculum, their winter habitat. What happens outside of these caves or mines or different hibernacula is the bats start to swarm, and that's when they mate. The females will then, after mating, will then move into the hibernacula. The males will stay out and mate many more times. Once the female moves into the hibernacula, we're into kind of that winter phase. Here's a good picture of just kind of swarming bats outside of a cave entrance. So they'll just swarm and just right at the entrance, and then the females will move in. The females will store the sperm of the males, and they'll hold it there all winter until the spring. But from roughly October to April, they're hibernating. And when I mean hibernating, they're not like bears where they're hibernating. If you kick a bear when it's sleeping or hibernating, it'll wake up and tear your leg off. If you go into a cave and take a bat off of the wall, it'll take a good 5 to 10 minutes for it to arouse and wake up. It'll sit there and just, it takes a lot of effort because they're basically shut down for those months. They will wake up, go get a drink of water, but then they're right back to shut down mode basically. It's typically caves and mines or other man-made structures, but those are the most, for the species that we're going to talk about, that's their typical hibernacula. They can be in clusters of, small groups of 1 to 5, or I've seen, walk into a cave and you see just thousands of bats in a cluster. So I think I've got a pretty good picture here. That's probably a few hundred bats right there. Each pink little dot right there is a nose. And so they're tightly packed in there. And so what they'll do is they'll just kind of tightly pack in there. They do that to conserve energy because they're all kind of just sharing their body warmth that is naturally generated there. And they do this to just kind of conserve energy, and they just shut down and live off the fat stores that they were building up in the late summer and fall. In the spring, around April to May 14th, the day before the summer starts, the bats start to wake up. The females will release the sperm, become pregnant, and then they will start moving towards their maternity sites. Roughly, Myotis and northern long-eared bats can travel between 8 to 350 miles to their maternity sites. we don't know a lot about spring migration. It's tough because our transmitters last, when we're doing telemetry and trying to find them, they last from anywhere from 5 to 14 days, and that's sometimes not enough time to get an accurate description of where they're going, how far they're going, but that is a research area that is growing and getting more attention, but they can travel far if their maternity sites are right next door, or they can fly pretty far if they need to. The summer, and this is where our focus is, because as foresters, that's the time that bats are used in the forest, is during the summer. So between May 15th and August 15th, that's a U.S. Fish and Wildlife guideline to the summer time for bats, and so that's when viable surveys can go on for bats between those days. So the females form maternity colonies of anywhere from 30 to 60 bats. They're a lot smaller too. They can be 3 or 4 bats in a colony. And so what these maternity colonies are, it's very similar to that picture I showed you of the hibernating bats all clustered together. What the females will do will be to move into these places with other mothers, and they'll be pregnant together and raise their young together, and they basically do this to conserve energy. So they go into these cracks, crevices, exfoliating bark, snags, and living trees, and they all cluster really close together to let that body warmth and the ambient temperature of the day, because summer months are obviously a lot hotter than winter, and if they're in kind of a snag, they can get a lot more solar exposure. And so all those characteristics of their tree, of their microhabitat, let them conserve energy for making their baby, or once the baby is born, producing milk. We give birth to 1 pup typically once a year. So that's part of the problem with managing this species, is because they're not like mice. I told you before, they're not flying mice. I really wish they were, because if they were, they'd reproduce a lot quicker and we probably wouldn't have this problem. But they reproduce, they have 1 pup, and so if you take a couple of bats during this maternity season, you're taking anywhere from, bats can live up to 20 to 30 years on good examples. And so that 1 bat that lives for 30 years is only producing 30 offspring to put back into the population. So it's not, it doesn't fill up quickly. So when we have catastrophic events like white nose syndrome that's killing millions of bats, it's very hard to just put back into the population. But to get back, pups after birth are able to fly within 3 to 5 weeks. Now, this isn't an easy, okay, great, May 15th, they're at their maternity colonies. May 20th, they give birth. 3 to 5 weeks later, the pups are flying and we've got juveniles around. It's all over the board when bats give birth, when the pups are able to fly on their own, and when they're not reliant on mother anymore. So just this past summer, we had bats that, late June, early July, when we expect usually the juveniles to start showing up, we were still finding pregnant bats. While at the same time finding some juveniles. So it's kind of all over the map with when they give birth and how long it takes to raise their young. So at the end of this, around middle of or beginning of August, the maternity colonies start to disperse. The juveniles are now able to fly on their own, and they kind of just leave their moms, and the colonies aren't really necessary to keep with warmth and raising young, so they start to focus in on just storing up body fat for the winter season. And so they start kind of moving towards their hibernaculum areas and just really building up their fat stores. Here's a good picture of kind of a roosting bat. We tracked to this roost. It was really easy to see. Most of the time when you track a bat, you're just listening to a signal, and it's 15 to 20 feet up in the air, and you're hoping it's where you think it is. But yeah, that's a great picture. So a little bit more about their habitat during the summer, especially northern long-eared bat. Their foraging habitat, they're typically like more cluttered interior forest than other species. So with like big brown bats and red bats and even Indiana and little browns, you'll see them going along corridors like streams, natural streams, or roads, cleared roads, ATV trails through a forest. But northern long-eared bats, we have found evidence of, if you just set up a net in the middle of a forest, you can catch northern long-eared bats. There's not, they're not working a trail or anything. They have a typically smaller foraging range than other species, around 1,000 hectares in Indiana, for example. You know, I don't have a lot of numbers, but we've got some numbers that Jen is going to be presenting later, and Rich will be presenting later. But this is a species that is a lot of research focus is starting to become on, and so we are going to be getting new data on these guys and new answers to what's going on. But for right now, the numbers are kind of limited, and we don't know a lot about them like we do Indiana bats or some of the other species that we've been working with for decades almost. They're roosting habitats, and this is one of the problems with managing and for you foresters is that they can use really any species. That it's not limited to, okay, they're only using maples or they're only using oaks. They can use any number of species. It's more about the micro habitat and what they need day to day to raise their young during this season. They can use different sizes depending on what they need for their colony size. If they are in a very small colony, they can obviously be in a lot smaller tree. And they switch trees roughly every 5 days, including 3 different trees. So it can make it very hard to just manage and be like, this bat is here from May 15th to August 15th in this roost, so we know to save this tree. They're all over the place, and they can travel pretty far to get to those different roosts. They're typically smaller ranges for that roost switching, but it's very variable. Oops, can you get back? Thank you. So real quick, I wanted to cover kind of the different survey methods that we use to study bats during their different seasons. I'm going to kind of fly through fall and spring because that's not, a lot of focus isn't on that. Our focus is really on the summer and the winter. But the fall swarm and migration time, we use what's called a harp net that's around known hibernacular, known roost sites. And we, harp traps, I'll show you a picture in a moment, but it just blocks their entrance and they fly into this trap, and we can get a quick census of what type of species there are and hopefully some numbers of the bats that are using this area or this hibernacula. Very similar to the spring, we use a harp trap as they're exiting and hope to get another count of what's leaving, and then at this time we can attach transmitters and try and find the distance that they're flying to their maternity colonies and really just what direction, so that we have an idea of where to start survey for them during the summer. Oh, I did it again, a little delayed. So here's a harp trap. Typically we'll block off this. But so I don't know if you can see that, but there's really fine lines. It's basically fishing lines, and it's about 2 or 3 rows of fishing line, and then just a little tarp at the bottom. And so basically we block it off, and they're forced to fly through here. And so they may be able to dodge that first row of fishing lines, and a lot of times you will see them do that, but then they're alternating rows, and so they'll crash into that second one, and it's not as violent as I'm making it sound, but they crash and then they just slide down here and can't get out. And so basically we just kind of sit there every 10 to 15 minutes, come and check the harp trap and then just kind of see what's in there. And like I said, we can attach transmitters, we can take measurements, we can just tell relative health of the cave or mine or hibernacula that they're using. For their winter surveys, these are typically, especially now with white nose, full cave surveys. And what we'll do is, if we have a known hibernacula, we'll go in and count and ID the species present and trying to get a really good idea of the numbers there. And this has been very common for Indiana bats because we know most of their hibernaculum. And so we'll go in and we take pictures of it, and kind of what I've done in the past is we'll have a foot apart lasers, and I'd sit there and there's supposed to be one of 12 inches across, but I'll measure block squares of those bats, and then we can measure, try and get density of the bats, and then we'll take photos, come back and basically just count noses to see the numbers there. But with white nose now, a big push is to check for the presence of white nose, and so we go in and see relative health of caves and mines and see if white nose is there, or if it has been there, how the bat population, how their health is. Summer surveys, this is again important for what we're talking about today. For northern long-eared bats, and MISO is Indiana bats, Myotis sodalis. It is spelled out by the Fish and Wildlife, our guidelines for summer surveys. They're between May 15th and August 15th, like I said before. It's got roughly about 4 phases to it. The first one is the habitat assessment, and then followed by some presence-absence surveys, which are the acoustic, mist net, and then trying to find roost trees so we can do emergence counts with the radio telemetry. So I'll kind of just go through that real quick. Habitat assessment is really like this. I used this example on a previous talk, and you guys may know this area. The conservation center is not too far from here. But so if I've got a project here that, here's the, fake project boundary, what I'll do as a bat biologist is just kind of look at the habitat within here and see where bats are likely to be. So let's pretend for a second that this is just all grassland and this is a forest patch here and a forest patch here. I'm going to focus my efforts of either putting out acoustic equipment or setting up mist nets around these forest areas where I think bats are going to be. Now, this is all forested area, and so what I could do then is, if these are all forested, is use this road and kind of set up a line of acoustic surveys and mist nets over this corridor, because the bats are going to be using that as flyways to get to forage. So after that, if we've determined that there's likelihood of bats in this area, we'll jump to the acoustic surveys. And this is an area very close here too, Mark. You were here at this picture. You're right behind me, I think, actually. This is our acoustic equipment right here. This is an Anabat within a weatherproof case. And so what we do is, this is just a little forest road here, and we just set these up, and it's a passive detector that will sit there overnight and just kind of record bat calls. And so we can get a sense of the species using it and relative activity. We can't get precise numbers, because if one bat flies over it and circles it all night, that's one bat. So we don't really have a way of detecting raw numbers, but we can get relative activity of the area. After that, it's not like bird species where we can hear a bird call and say, oh, it's this species. We have to download the software or download the data and then look at it on this software called AnaLook. So Anabats and AnaLook. And this is like a typical bat call when they're echolocating. And so we can, based on the frequency of their call, we can determine species or species type. If it's a Myotis species, it's typically a lot higher. Those big brown bats that are bigger, larger species, they're around here. The hoary bats are then down here. And so by the shape of their calls and the relative frequency of it, we can determine species. And so a lot of times what we'll do is we'll do these surveys, determine if you've got Indiana bats or northern long-eared bats, and then we'll come in with the mist net surveys. Now this just looks like a creek to you, but there's a mist net pole here and a mist net pole over here and a mist net going across right in front of that. It's great because you can't see it, and it's harder for the bats to detect. It's this fine microfilament net that we set up across corridors or areas where we had acoustic hits of the species we're targeting. And what we do is basically we just sit out there all night and just wait for bats to kind of hit the net, and we check them every 5 to 10 minutes, and we can get another sense of the species in the area. We target the species like northern long-eared bats or Indiana bats, but we get all in between. And so this type of survey we can do presence, absence, probable absence, or it is present if we do catch it. So when we catch them, we take some measurements. We do forearm, we do weight, we do species, gender, age, if it's a juvenile or an adult, and then we check the reproductive condition, especially for females. We can tell if they're pregnant, lactating, or if they've just finished lactating. For those targeted bats that we're looking for, a lot of times we'll put a band on so that we can give that information to DNR or Fish and Wildlife. And so if other bat researchers find that band, we can count it and tell where that bat's been moving from where we caught it. And then the important thing is this contraption right here. This is a transmitter that we put on these bats, and they last for, like I said, 5 to 20 days in some instances. But basically we put those on there, and we're trying to find where these bats are during the day. So the next day we'll go out and track those bats to their roosts and trying to find what they're using, what habitat they're using. And our hopes are that with one bat track, we can find a tree that's full of like 60 bats. And so then we can know more of the value of that forest stand. So after we found the tree, here's a good example of a couple of trees that we found in the past. They're very variable. This is a great snag with tons of roosting opportunities, some exfoliating bark, some crevices, some cracks, and then here's a very healthy red maple that's just, maybe a crack up in here or up in here, and that's where they're roosting. So it's very variable, live, dead, which makes it very hard to manage. Once we find these, we go out and sit there at sunset and wait for the bats to come out, and then we do a count of the species, or a count of the bats that are coming out, and that's called an emergence count. And then we can get, like I said, a relative idea of how many bats are using this tree in this habitat. So, just to fly through this because we've got some other people talking about this topic. Obviously we're here because bats aren't doing well right now, and we're gonna discuss the potential listing of northern long-eared bat. White nose syndrome is the driving factor behind the potential listing for long-eared bats. Confirmed fungus finding at Sudan Underground Mine State Park and Forestville Mystery Cave State Park here in Minnesota. So it is moving in the area. It hasn't been detected on bats yet, but it has the fungus that causes it has been found. It is spreading west. I'll show you a map here in a second. White nose has killed more than 5.7 million bats in the eastern part of the United States and Canada. And in some hibernacula, especially where it was first found, it's 90% mortality of the bats that are used in that cave. Here's an example of typical white nose bat. Just the fungus and all that just kind of grows around it. Again, I'll let the other people talk about white nose later, but just to give you guys an idea of why we're here talking about these guys. It was first detected here in New York, and then it's spread all over within the last several years. So here's the two sites in Minnesota that it was detected at, and yeah, so we need to find more hibernacula, need to know more about what they're using in these areas and see if white nose is present on some of those. Some other threats to bats, wind turbines, you guys probably heard about that, habitat loss, and hibernaculum disturbance. Now, what we're really here for today is to try and help with habitat loss. That's where the forestry comes in, and bat-friendly forestry, which is why we're here. So again, I'll let those people talk about that today, but that it is, when we have an event, a catastrophic event like white nose come in and kill millions of bats, these wind turbines and habitat loss that weren't really hurting their populations before now come into effect because now the populations are so low that any taking of the animal is now a lot more significant than it was in the past. So I don't want to leave on a sour note. Bats in Minnesota are doing well right now. Like we said, there's a couple of sites with white nose fungus detected, but as other people will talk about today, the bats are healthy right now, and we caught a lot of them this summer, and I'll let them get into the numbers, but it's not all dire straits right now, but it could be very soon. So with that, I think that's about it. If you guys have any questions, I'll be around all today and tomorrow, so please feel free to come talk to me, and I don't know if we have time for questions right now. Yeah, thank you. No, they can have many bats, like I was saying about the maternity colonies. If that's a big snag and there's a lot of bats using it, it's typically species specific, so you'll typically just find northern long-eared bats or species just using that. I have found Indiana bats and little brown bats using the same tree, I had two transmitters and they converged on the same tree, so it was very interesting, but it's typically just one species. There's territory I've seen for foraging. I've seen big brown bats attacking other bats that are kind of in their flyways and stuff, but for roost trees, if it's the maternity colony, they're kind of welcome to the more the merrier.
Could you hear that in the back, or do we need to use a mic for questions?
Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah, the question was about whether in
Yeah, so how many bats roost or hibernate in caves of the 7 listed in Minnesota, and then which ones are vulnerable to white nose? Is that correct? If we could jump back to that slide real quick. I can go through them real quick. It's right at the beginning. Yeah, that one I think. So tricoloreds, big browns, northern long-eared, little browns, and sometimes silver-haired bats too will hibernate in caves. The other eastern reds and hoary bats typically migrate south, and they have different hibernating strategies if they don't go south enough to where it's warm. So all those bats that are hibernators in caves, tricoloreds, big browns, sometimes silver-haired, northern long-eared bats, and little brown bats are all vulnerable to white nose. And interestingly enough, at a recent white nose symposium, white nose was detected on eastern red bats, and I'm not sure about hoary bats, but and it's silver-haired bats. So not high numbers, not enough to decimate them, and their hibernating strategies are very different. They don't cluster together. They typically go on the ground, roll up in a leaf, and take the chance that nothing's going to step on them, basically. And so it's not as I don't think they're at risk because they don't congregate together, and so they're not spreading it within a small space. But it has been detected on them. So it's if a bat goes into a cave just for a night, they are vulnerable to get the white nose. Yes, sir. What are some of the natural predators of bats? That's a great question. They're kind of, like I said before, I think of them kind of as lions because they're kind of at the top of their food chain. There's not a lot of predation on bats. It does happen. They're really great flyers, but those ones that crash or fall in a cave or at a roost, anything can be at the bottom waiting for them. Snakes, skunks, possums, foxes, raccoons, anything can be waiting for them down there. But as far as active predation, there's not much. So when I catch a bat, they really are. They're mad, and they're what the heck are you doing? I'm the best out there. You can't hold me. And they get mad and try and bite because they're not used to anything really coming into their space for that reason. So they do get, and owls and stuff will get them, but it's not active. It's not really enough to hurt a population or anything like that. Yes, ma'am. A little bit more about their lifespan and what's causing them to die. So typically, they give birth to one pup a year, and then they're hibernating for almost 8 to 9 months out of a year. So they can live very long. A typical life is probably around 10 years, and that's very different from mice because they're reproduce really quickly, and then they're basically food for other animals. But we've had records of 30 to almost 40 years using those bands that I was showing you in that previous slide. Just going back in the caves, you can, take record of that bat that had the band and go back in the records and see when it was caught, where it was caught, and kind of get an estimate of age. That's kind of on the high end, but they do live a lot longer than other bats or other species of mammals that are about that size. Other things that are killing them is, like I said, wind turbines. They can fly into wind turbines and die. Habitat loss, if you cut a tree down or disturb a tree during the summer that they're actively giving birth or feeding their young, then that can cause them to die yeah. And then hibernaculum disturbance. It's very similar to white nose. Why they're dying because of white nose is because they're basically having to wake up in the winter. And if they're aroused in the winter, they're burning their fat stores that they've stored up all summer and fall, and they're burning through it. And if they wake up in the winter, especially here in Minnesota, there's no bugs out. It's far too cold for bugs to survive. And so if they are aroused or have burned through their fat stores, then they're going to starve. And that's a big part of why white nose is killing them, is because they're either waking up to fight the fungus, or they're burning fat stores, fighting it while they're sleeping, and then they wake up and all their fat stores have been burned off, and then they're going out and starving.